So thank you, Maria, and thank you, Jules, for organizing this presentation. I just want to make a preliminary. Um, why did I present this particular topic? It is because of Maria, actually. We were having a discussion on a particular presentation that we both participated in. And this was related to the way postcolonialism and decolonialism and the approaches to these two perspectives are influencing urban studies. And, she asked me whether I could present some of my ideas on this, given that I also work on the history of these ideas in global social theory. So I said, yes, this is a very preliminary presentation because I haven't really engaged with this in a deeper way. But let me start by by making a first statement of what is postcolonial and decolonial perspective. In my opinion, postcolonial and decolonial perspectives are organically connected, but they are different positions. And these positions are based on distinct geopolitical historical readings of colonialism, and thus have specific theoretical and methodological genealogies. Post-colonial perspective critiques the representation of the Orient or the East, organized in Europe since 16th and 17th centuries, but legitimized in the academic discipline of Oriental studies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and since then institutionalized in the academic disciplines of the binaries, organizing, humanities, and social sciences from the mid and late 19th century. And I'll come back to this point of binaries later in this presentation. Methodologically, it uses the post-structuralist and deconstruction methodologies to comprehend the way power organized the knowledge of the Orient in Europe. Decolonial perspectives traces the way Eurocentric assumptions of evolutionism and dualism, again the binaries, theorized by Annibal Quijano, structured consciousness of the non-European and European other since the Iberian invasion of the Americas in the 16th century. Thus, this decoloniality analyzes the origin and spread of Occidentalism and Europe's understanding of its own history as modern civilization in context to the other. Quijano uses the methods of historical sociology to comprehend the way Eurocentric knowledge emerges as Americas got integrated within the global world system. So this is a very crude, immediate ways to present the two positions. These are much more nuanced, and they embed in the scholarship of many, many scholars across the various continents of the world. But I've just given you these two slides to give a very a summary of these positions. Now, the reason why I'm discussing this is that, and as there are researchers who are listening at this moment, I want to go back to the time when I was doing a PhD in sociology in the 70s. And whilst I was doing PhD in sociology, I was asking myself the question, what does sociology in India give me to understand how to understand cities and the urban world in India? And I realized that the dualities that I was talking to you about, which is there both in postcolonial and theorizing as well as decolonial theorizing, were actually institutionalized within the knowledge and disciplines of two kinds within India. So the economic and political science disciplines understood what India was going through as modernity, while sociology and anthropology and partially history understood what India was in terms of its past. As a consequence, sociology dealt with what was the village, what was agrarian structure, what was the rural, and what were its institutions, caste, primordial institutions, caste, family, extended family system, and religiosities. While political science, as well as economics, understood contemporary modernity as a way to think of contemporary India. So we had these dualities that we were constantly as students engaging with. And it is in the methods of postcolonialism and in the methods of decoloniality, I ultimately understood where this comes from. And this comes from Quijano, as Quijano has said, a notion of evolutionism and dualism that had emerged within Europe, which suggested that Europe itself went through evolutionary stage from being an agrarian feudal system to urban industrial system. And this was there, therefore, in the way in which social sciences understood what is both industrialization and urbanization as against rurality. So, particularly in the discipline of sociology, three evolutionary assumptions based on dualism were conceptualized. First, an evolutionary understanding drawn from some classical thinkers that the urban represents the organization of modern society and evolves from agrarian feudal through a two-stage model. For example, Marx divides country and town. Secondly, the city and the urban emerges with industrialization and work specialization, differentiation, or we can call differentiation. And thirdly, the city form represents the urban. To study the urban, one needs to study the city. It is no wonder that in countries like India, these assumptions were used in the 50s and 60s to further the theories of modernization. Research on the two-stage model from rural to urban industrial through migration, from joint extended family to nuclear family through differentiation of communities and growth of social problems, all crime, etc. And the concentric model of cities became a way to understand the urbanization and the city formation that took place. So there were two assumptions, as I mentioned. The first assumption was that industrialization leads to urbanization. And secondly, urbanization is equivalent to the city form. So we had in the 50s and 60s the study of metropolitan cities such as Bombay, Calcutta, Delhi, Madras. They were all partially industrial cities. And an understanding of these cities as being modern based on technological infrastructure, mass housing, city level management of sanitation and water systems, electric systems, etc. So urban sociology was thought as a spatial system of new and novel culture of modernity and growth of new sociabilities that created novel, inclusive relationships, a site for the formation of new communities, nations, lifestyles, and citizenship. It is in 70s onwards that there was a recognition globally that in the world that cities in the underdeveloped country were not emulating Western experience. This was true, particularly true of these metropolitan cities that I just mentioned. And it is at this point of time there is a discovery of a new form characterizing cities of such underdeveloped countries, and this was slum. For example, it was proved, and it is true, that Bombay, more than half of its population lived in slums. So there was a theory of dystopias of urban growth um, presented. And slums were associated with poverty, informal housing, little to no access to physical infrastructure, informal economies, and of course, crime and drugs. It is this history that I think post-colonial and decolonial theories can help to expose. Because as I mentioned, it is based on the idea that there is a model that Europe went through, and this is the model in which the rest of the world is followed. Secondly, it is also based on the idea that the urban is the end result of what is the modern civilization. And this urban is only can be evident in the structure of a form called a city, which is a built form. And this built form is leads to better lifestyles and better ways of living, which ultimately helps people to be happy, to be more inclusive, and uh, to have better lifestyles. It's I think postcolonialism helps in trying to understand how to deconstruct ways in which the ideology of the urban has got associated with modernity. And this ideology is part of the aspirational class who have got the benefits of um, these ways of living. And therefore, they believe that this is the way in which we can understand the urban. But a deconstruction approach helps to uh, perceive how this is a very limited and a completely a mythology. And I will try to show how the post-90s ways of thinking has helped to rethink what is the urban. When I say all this, I just want to put a caution, a word of caution, because I work as a sociologist, and I am a sociologist, and I'm also a historian of the study of ideas and of disciplinary ideas. So my approach to this is limited to a historical sociological view of this. Urban studies includes many experts from many different disciplines, from planning, geography, to economics, to politics, and they may intervene in a different way. I'm here intervening from my own disciplinary perspective. So I want to start off with how do you use post-colonialism after using decolonial methods? How can one use post-colonial? And I would suggest the first instance of understanding the mythology of the form of the city as being equivalent to the urban. And secondly, the mythology of the urban not being there because there is a village and there is a rural, both of which can be understood by the critique of the census. And this is the census of India. So visual documentation and popular literature has suggested that India is rapidly urbanizing. However, the 2011 census suggests that only 31% of India is urban and the rest is rural. This dualism is based on the definition of what urban means in the census. The urban is defined, and please note what the way it is defined. India is 1.3 billion people today. Yet, only 5,000 plus population is defined as urban, but with a density of 400 people per square kilometer and 75% of its population employed in non-agricultural activities and governed by a municipality. Consequently, urbanists have argued that urbanization, therefore, is not taking place in India. Actually, from 2001 to 2011, there has been hardly any urban growth. Rather, there has been a decrease of 0.03% in the annual exponential growth of urban population, almost similar, and it is almost similar to the decade back. Given this definition, additional data has argued also because of this definition of urban has expanded to other data sets. This data set has argued that migration from rural to urban has in fact declined. However, even if it has declined, why is it that the agricultural activities have also declined? And the number of population within agriculture has declined. So how do we square up between what the census data says and what has happened? And I think it is now that we have a new argument, rural-agarian. Settlements having urban characteristics, retaining rural social economic base, which means that urbanization is not equivalent to city growth and a particular built structure in a particular built way as emulated within a European understanding. Rather, we have settlements having all urban characteristics, but having been based in largely agriculture areas. We see, therefore, a new pattern of urbanization, expansion in the periphery of highly developed regions because cities have become highly unequal and cannot sustain additional population. There is regional integration with uneven spread, migration of enterprises from cities into the peripheries, leading to the growth of informal housing and informalized working population. Plus, the neoliberal initiatives have withdrawn investments in public infrastructure as villages in the peripheries have spread to become towns. And we have therefore a new form of urbanization, which I have called variegated and segmented geographies. What are its characteristics? Its characteristics are spatial inequalities, uneven investments in built form, high capital investment in part of settlements, that is high rises and gated communities, and low capital investment for the self-built housing. Income inequalities and exclusions, uneven access to physical infrastructure, housing, sanitation, electricity, potable water, access to education, roads, and transportation, and informalization of labor. India has today 85 to 95% of its workers in the informal sector. And this is the highest if you compare to the rest of the world. Here, households combine agriculture work. They may have land, they may be peasants, but they also may have businesses. They could also be traders. They could be individuals who may have, they may have individuals in the household who may migrate to access low-end services and thereby have unregulated work, low paid, unskilled, and flexible with long working hours, with little to no social security And these workers are segmented in terms of caste, community, and gender. So informal work and labor is being reproduced as an economy that is highly competitive, mobile, driven by short-term profits, combining various kinds of technologies, from primitive to mechanized to informational, relating production together with control and discipline of labor. So there is unfree bondage, slave labor to free and self-employed labor, and being held in various sites: households, sweatshops, small-scale industrial units, agricultural land. So these informal economies promote a specialization through short-term and long-term migration as families fragment into 2 to 3 households, 2 to 3 dwellings, and regroup with other laborers into new households with new family formations. This is not recognized legally. And because it's based in absolute poverty of the workers, it thus affects the long-term stability of households as economic unit, and thus of investment in the continuity of dwellings and larger settlements, and in turn therefore of housing as a built form. These dwellings therefore cannot be called slums, as understood in India as temporary and non-permanent dwellings built with recycled material pieces of wood, cardboard, tarpaulin, and corrugated sheets as they sustain households over decades. So this informal economy of workers that constitute 85 to 95% of the population are being controlled by 5 to 15% of the population of intermediate classes through outsourcing processes that organize production, distribution, consumption, and reproduction of commodities, housing, and services, together with the reproduction of households and families. And this is the way in which one can understand the limited democracy and the limited citizenship that we see in the country, the limited political representation and the conflicts that emerge, which includes caste and community conflicts. It is these which needs to be understood as the process of urbanization. However, government policies remain restricted to big cities to create high capital investment, having smart solutions. And they continue with the Eurocentric assumptions of creating large cities and to have the population which they represent, which is the 5 to 15% of it, to remain in cities in upper class gated communities. So this is just a brief synopsis of what I think that decolonial and postcolonial theories can help us in reframing ways to think of the urban. I hope it has been useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujata, for this very much thought-provoking talk. Thank you for responding so intelligently to my call to engage with these issues. And I'm sure there are many questions. Let's see if people are ready. I have quite a few, but let's perhaps put our videos on. Give some time to people to who want to put their videos on, so it feels more like we're together somehow and have some kind of dialogue in these difficult days. And let's see if we can take a first question. Maybe I can ask my question while people are collecting their thoughts. Sujata, you and I'm very much agree with you that one of the key challenges and which is important politically is to break, if you wish, or query this mythology of the ideology of the urban associated with modernity, and how this ideology of the urban is linked to aspiration of middle classes or privileged parts of the population. And I fully agree with you. And this is one of the key challenges for intellectual work today. But I want to bring you my some experience from the work I've done with Harela Mustafdaroglu and refugees in Greece, mainly from Syria. We did the work in Greece, Athens, Istanbul, and Belgrade. And so it turned out that refugee and migrant populations, to them, this centrality of the urban is very important. So they're placed, all the refugee camps are placed at the periphery of cities, out of sight and out of mind. And what they do is they escape the refugee. I mean, they're not locked in refugee camps, but they try to come to the city center, and then they squat or they create collectives and they rehouse themselves in city centers. And in our interviews, it was this centrality that they were looking for, is their right to the city center very explicitly. And in a way, if you wish, this can be construed as buying into that mythology. And of course, that's a big part of the story, that they buy into that mythology, they buy into that ideology, and say that in a positive way. They want to be part of it. But there's another part of it that says that their lives and their stories, scripting their lives and their stories into that centrality matters. It matters for them, but also it matters for us and it matters politically. So how do we grapple? How do we navigate between these tensions? Yes, it is a mythology. Yes, it is an ideology, but it matters in the now and the here. And it matters for subaltern populations, not just for the middle classes. Yeah, thank you.
Do I wait for another question, or can I answer your question?
Maybe we can answer the first one briefly, and while people collect their thoughts.
I agree with you completely. Last March, when India went into a lockdown, and complete lockdown, because they closed the supply side of the economy completely. So they closed all production systems. There was never anything like this seen anywhere in the world. It just created shortages because no one could get anything after 15, 20 days. No food, nothing, because no supply was being given. Okay. And I won't talk about the governance issues here, but at that time, it was recognized that there was a rebellion, of course, by the poor, and it was recognized that that most of the big cities, 50% of the workers of the informal sector were from parts of North India, from villages. And they had come to the city for this reason, that they wanted to aspire for the best. If the rich can aspire, so can they. And if you look at their clothes, they were wearing blue jeans, t-shirts. They were occupied in e-commerce. Some of them in the mobile shops, etc. They were living in cramped quarters of 8 by 8 feet, and so cramped that they were hiring beds for 8 hours so that they can stay in these areas. And what for the first time The government, some people went to the Supreme Court, and it was found that the government had no statistics of this migration into the cities, which constituted 40 to 50% of the informal workers of the cities, which we have now come to know today, after 1 year, okay, when they went back. When they went back to their villages because the city could not sustain them. And it is, of course, of the right to the city. I agree with you. The question is, can capitalism, which is organized in the way it is, and particularly neoliberal capitalism, which does not have a way to understand how to ensure social security of the poor, can it sustain their right to the city? That's the question. And I would like to argue that this is not the problem of today. It is the problem of the discourse that has come from the 30s and the 40s, 1930s and the 40s, where the elite has not thought of what is sustainability within the urban rural agrarian structures. So it needs a different kind of an economy, which can handle the problem both of employment, of ecology, of sustainable, not only employment, but sustainable infrastructure, as well as in the larger problematic of the Anthropocene that we need to see in the background. And I don't think that imagination exists. At least I don't see that imagination existing among the elite of the country, who first did not think of just thought of the cities, or did not even theorize what could be the way to understand the cities, because they just borrowed these concepts. And these concepts, which were their aspirations, has now got have now become part of the aspirations of the poor also.
Yeah.
However, there is hardly any understand of what utopias these new cities can give to everyone. And therefore, what we find is that given the lack of understanding, only aspiration is of wanting the same thing as the elite, which the neoliberal ideology would like to promote, but it does not imply a new way of thinking of the urban, which I think is what is needed now.
Thank you. I fully agree. I couldn't agree more with you. Yes, thank you very much. And it's not forthcoming, neither by the intellectuals nor by policymakers. No. But we'll keep debating that, I'm sure. So there is a question by Afra, I think. Am I right?
Yes. I wanted to follow up on that, actually. I had a similar question, and I was my PhD research is in Accra, and I find that I'm hearing the same discourses indeed, right? A lot of the middle class aspirations, and even the words used are around progress. Quite literally, people say we want progress, we want modernity, we want development. So so the same thing actually that Professor Maria was saying, Professor Kaika, sorry. So I wanted to ask you then, how do we engage with this as, young researchers? Because on the one hand, I don't want to disregard what my interlocutors are saying, right? I don't want to be dismissive of it, because it's a very real aspiration, it's a very real thing. I don't want to be dismissive, and at the same time, I do want to contribute to building this new imagination of what the city could look like. So I'm just curious how you would, what you would suggest in terms of moving forward with these kinds of insights.
So I think there are two levels of analysis that needs to be done here. The first level is to situate the ways in which policies, processes, and sociabilities are entrenched in the ways in which um, uh, the mythologies of urban, one kind of urban. I'm not saying that there is one universal urban. I'm saying that there are many different forms of being urban, right? And how one kind of this mythology has got institutionalized through policies, through processes, through sociabilities that are there. And I think that's the role that social scientists can play by interrogating the assumptions that are there, which take place within certain scales, whether it is regional, local, or national scales. They take place in those scales. And it is important to understand these circuits of knowledge that are organized, which bring forth these ideologies and mythologies. I gave a presentation on one circuit of knowledge, which is based on the national. But you can have, depending on what kind of settlements we are talking about, some of these settlements have autonomies to decide their own policies. So you might have different local scales or regional scales, etc. But the second level is to critique it. And it is there, I think, one needs to associate with interventions that are made on behalf of the subalterns, and also make a critique of those groups, activists, political parties, etc., in terms of what we understand as citizenship. Lefebvre is the one who talked about the right to the city. But do remember, the right of the city that he's talking about is based on his understanding of the experience of French democracy and the way the French discussions on citizenship has taken place. And the question that I have with all those who are working with the subaltern groups is what kind of utopias you have of the new way of thinking of urban, which is not only of their small groups, but of the larger conditions that have generated these problems. And a critique of that also is very important as social scientists. That's the way I would like to answer this. So I do not think that we can become, one can act as a citizen and simultaneously, if you are from Accra, I don't know, I'm from India, so I work as a citizen separately from being a social scientist, and I think I need to keep the two things separate.
Thank you, Sujata. Thank you, Afra. Let's see, do we have another question? Yes, we have many questions now. Let's see, I saw Guishi. Am I pronouncing this correctly?
Yes, Cho Jie, but it should be fine. Yeah. And thank you very much for.
And then Esther, I think. Was it Esther afterwards? Maybe we can take it one at a time. Yeah.
Sure. And thanks so much for the talk. It's really inspiring. And my research focus is on urban China. So in a way, I find it's quite hard to understand some parts of China using the Western concept as well. And I quite agree that the Western way of urban is just one way. And I quite appreciate your term, the urbanization, which is really inspiring for me. So my question is that, do you think we should develop more terminologies or vocabularies to understand the situation in developing countries, or to broaden the existing concepts like urban? So there are two ways to do this. So which way do you think is more leading in contemporary urban studies?
So thank you for your question. I just saw a very interesting paper which compares China and India. Both are big countries, both have large population, and therefore the nature of scales here are different from other parts of the countries, you know. For instance, Sweden has 10 million and Bombay itself is 15 million. So we can see the different scales that are there. And these scales are very important because population and population density has a very major role to play in the way in which distribution of resources takes place. So I agree with you that there has to be new conceptual frames. And this is where postcolonial decolonialism helps us, because it talks about the way these are not there, you know, and therefore I think we need to engage with them, but accept that there are limitations in the way the decolonial and postcolonial has emerged itself, because both postcolonialism and decolonialism came out from the Americas with the America's experience. Postcolonialism came from 79 onwards, Orientalism, and then the subaltern studies, and the decolonial was also in the same time, 80s onwards from Latin America. And then it transferred itself to United States. What I'm trying to say is that there is path dependency, because the particular way in which policies, processes, knowledge, economy, ecology has got structured is related to ways to think of that particular geography, you know, that it has got constituted. And that path dependency makes it important that the cognitive also separate itself out. And therefore, that I have always argued for diverse cities, different variegated ways of thinking, because concepts may have different meanings in different parts of the world. And for instance, I mentioned that in India, almost 85% at the minimum is informal workers, which is not true for Latin America, may not be true for other parts of the world. So we have to think in terms of the path dependency, and the cognitive also has to be part of that. And therefore, we have to create knowledge systems. I think this is my way of thinking, that will accept the differences. Otherwise, we will never be able to decenter the Eurocentric positions, you know. And I think there are many levels at which these interventions have to be made. And we have to think of the particular geographies that we have to start with to be able to do so. Because I think geographies are made cognitively depending on the way path dependency are organized. If that makes sense to you. Are you speaking from China?
No, I'm from Oxford, but I used to study because
Okay.
now in the geography department of Oxford also they're quite heavily stressed on decolonization as well. So I'm quite interested in the topic. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. We have Esther has a question next.
Yes, thank you. That was a very inspiring talk. I was wondering if when we're thinking about something like urbanization, do we need to also look into the mythologies of the rural in addition to the mythologies of the urban? I'm working on a research project about imagining the rural. I'm a humanities scholar, so I'm a little bit out of my depth here among sociologists. But so I've been looking into a lot the kind of imaginations of the rural that are at play in different countries. And India is not one of my case studies, but China is, for example. And I think it's really interesting to look at how these mythologies of the urban and mythologies of the rural play into each other, but also sometimes are able to really challenge each other, and how they also shift in relation to each other in different periods and in different geographies. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how urbanization can also lead to a re-theorization or reframing of the rural and what kind of utopias or dystopias the rural can offer?
Thank you for this question, because actually this is the only way that one theorist thought of understanding how to ensure the symbiotic linkage between rural and urban, by taking over the mythology that was given to all of us. Okay, so this is a concept by Kundu, Amitabh Kundu, who is actually an urbanist. And, a critique of the census led him to come to think that this is a way to answer it. But this concept has been highly criticized. But we don't have another one at this moment. Okay, that is why I gave a description of what it could mean without giving a concept. Because it does mean that people will be in agricultural activities. But they are connected by media across the world. They have mobiles and they have cell phones, but they don't have smartphones. Okay, they have a low-end technology phone, which allows them to be connected to their families and within the households as well as the community, but it is still low-end, And they never have post-paid, they always have prepaid, and half the time they cannot connect up 10 days of the month. Which means that their sociabilities are distributed in different ways. And it needs a lot more work to understand this, ways of behavior in which there is technological connect, but the work is itself not technologically, capital intensive, technologically oriented. So it is a very distinct, uneven ways of also using technology and upper end technologies, because their work makes them, if they don't have money, makes them walk and not use even the bus or any other means of transport to reach another place. Okay, they don't have motorized transport, not even a moped sometimes. And they sometimes, we had scenes in last April, May, when people were walking on railway tracks to go back and walking like 50 kilometers a day to reach after 20 days or 30 days to their homes, because they did not have the money to use the transport, even trains, even railways, which are highly subsidized in terms of tickets. So how do we understand this life? Okay, it's a life which is organized for them in cities, but it is not giving them access. And therefore I said that this is about survival strategies, and short-term survival strategies, not long-term. Therefore, there is no long-term investment in dwellings, in reproducing life. And with neoliberalism, this has made it more difficult, because the state has withdrawn all public services. Okay, so some NGOs and some political parties might say right to the city is the best way. But what I'm trying to suggest is that they do not have any investment in the city. They are there only for gaining access to some aspirations. And we have seen, at least in my country, I don't know, Maria, if this is true in Turkey, but India has a very high, India has a very big film industry, and they are part of fan clubs. And they spend a lot of money for that, with actors and movies and things like that, and downloading films and television serials. It's different from, you know, everyday life, which is sheer survival. So it's very difficult to understand how to think about this. It's very, and with a large number of the population in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, South Asia, living on these edges of margin and survival, how are we going to think of villages? Because in the pandemic, in the first pandemic that we had, first wave of pandemic, they could go back to the rural villages and find food over there, right? Because the villages were not affected by the pandemic. But in this second COVID, no. Second wave that we see in India, what you are seeing on the screens of television is what happened to Delhi. But today, the worst affected are the villages. There is no food there, and people are dying every day. That's why we see on the riverbeds so many dead bodies. They don't have money to even bury or to cremate. Yeah. So because the second wave brought them back to the villages and that affected the infection rate. So now everyone is affected, upper class, middle class, lower class. So how do we see these linkages? I don't know. I don't have it is not the earlier village. It is not the earlier rurality. I don't know how to say this, is it? But I think it gives us an epistemic opening today. And I think we should recognize that this epistemic opening allows us to rethink in new ways. And we have to get rid of this idea that high rises and gated communities and organized city formation is what we will see in most of the world. We'll only see it for the upper sections, if at all, today.
Thank you so much for that.
Thank you so much, Sujata. Thank you, Esther, for the question and answer. It's very sad that we are almost out of time. But maybe, Sujata, if you don't mind, if there is one more question, we can take one last question, if there is one in the audience. Yes, I see João. Please, go ahead.
All right. Hi, everyone, and thanks, Sujata, for such a very interesting presentation and reflections. And I highly appreciated the way you talked about the importance of informality, economic informality, for understanding urbanization in global South countries and global South cities. But I was also thinking about the problems associated with the term informality and how it is also derived from a kind of modern and colonial dualism between the formal and the informal. I speak from Brazil, and here in Latin America, there's a growing scholarship on kind of a decolonial critique of informality, which connects to the idea of popular economies, which is a different way to talk about all those very complex forms of wealth creation and different kinds of labor, which is different from how informality defines itself in opposition to formality. It's also something lacking. It's a wageless works or some kind of lack of regulation and so on. So, but at the same time, I understand the importance of the term. It's still very relevant. What do we make of this? How can we understand informality, considering this post-colonial and decolonial critiques, how this is being discussed in India specifically?
Okay, thank you for this. This is one more term which needs rethinking. And I agree with you, because it's caught into the binary. formal and informal. I think there has been some theorization regarding uh, regarding peasant urbanization. I can't think of any other way of putting this, about peasant life enmeshed in agrarian and urban services. And unlike Brazil, which has become so urbanized, India has not become urbanized in that context. And therefore, peasantry remains an important element, even though it's decreasing day by day. And a peasant mode of production of an urban kind has been thought of by various Marxist economists and sociologists. But, we really don't have a way to think of. That's why I gave a description of what it means, because households would mean, actually, I didn't even give a gender distinction, but women will continue with looking after households and looking after peasant agriculture, while male be looking after services. And the three generations of families always have to live together, because if they break up, there is no survival possible, So it is difficult to understand the dynamics that allows this survival households to survive as they integrate themselves within both the urban and the industrial world. And sometimes these women who are also the main peasant producer can also be domestic maids simultaneously. So it is extremely difficult to handle this complex forms of integration that is taking place. And that is why some people have mentioned it as ruberization. But I agree with you that the informal-formal sector distinction has to be rethought. And given the fact that Europe itself is understanding what deregulation has meant as far as informalization of migration, migrant workers has implicated itself in European economy, I think it's high time that we rethink what is the global capitalist economy from the periphery rather from the metropole, and that may be the universalizing set of proposition rather than what we saw in Europe or North America. But that's just a hope, because it needs some very systematic work to handle that. Because as you know, the informal sector concept itself came in the early 70s. So we are just 4 decades into it, and which came from Africa. And then it was taken by anthropologists. And in India, the economists who come to it have come to it just 10 years back. So there's a lot to work on. And I don't know about how it has been in Brazil, but I certainly know that there is more an understanding of marginalization in Latin America than the way we are talking in India of South Asia, particularly of labor and work. So, but.
Right. Thank you so much.
Many thanks to all for your questions. Many thanks, Sujata, for offering us this opportunity to really engage with you. You've been very generous with your time. You always have this unique way to ground high theory and difficult concepts to everyday life while keeping it deeply political. And I really admire that quality. And I think it's very important academically and socially for where we're at today. So thank you for that.
Okay,
Please,
thank you
sure.
so much. And thank you all of you